All right, so with that, I will turn things over to Brian Scholl.
Thank you, everybody. Can you hear me? Thank you to the organizers for the invitation and to the warm welcome. It was an especially warm welcome, and it's been an exciting trip ever since I landed yesterday at the Rome airport at 6:25 in the morning. I have never before landed at an airport that was literally on fire. From this same article, this is actually a picture of the airport yesterday, shortly before I landed. So a warm welcome indeed. No thanks at all to the previous speakers who all ended exactly on time. That was very selfish of you, and you've set a horrible precedent. However, because we were waiting for people to filter in, do note, Sharon, we did not start until 4:35, so we'll go from there. Because we have so much time for questions and discussion, I figured I would try to talk about something provocative and hopefully discussion-worthy. But it's a little different than the stuff that I would normally talk about from our lab. So let me start by trying to situate the material today in the broader context of our research. So I am a vision scientist. I study the nature of how we see. And our lab at Yale is called the Perception and Cognition Laboratory, not just because that is sort of an inclusive title, but because we are especially interested in our group about how perception and cognition relate to each other, and more generally, how perception is integrated into the rest of the mind. And there are many different kinds of such perception-cognition interactions. Most of our research I would summarize by the slogan that vision is smart. So we're very interested in how perception traffics in properties and representations that we typically think of in terms of higher level cognition. So most of our work and most of the talks I would normally give are about how properties like causality, animacy, intentionality, persistence, rationality are actually wired into how visual processing works in the first place. And so we go around writing papers about causal perception, about the psychophysics not just of color and orientation and motion, but the psychophysics of something like chasing, which we think is wired into the visual system. And we have all sorts of reasons that we tend to give for why we think these things are implicated in visual processing per se. We talk about shared visual phenomenology, dramatic dependence on subtle image details, activation of visual brain areas, and on and on. And what I'm going to try to focus on today is really just the sort of this afterthought in most of our work, which is this idea that one way to identify something, some aspect of seeing, is really being involved with visual processing per se, is that it appears to be dramatically dependent on subtle image details and essentially nothing else. It's unaffected by our desires, our intentions, our knowledge, etc. And that's what I'm really going to talk about today. So instead of talking about how vision is smart, I'm going to talk about how vision is vision, and how it is functionally independent from all of these other things that we typically associate, rightly so, with higher level cognition, things like beliefs, desires, emotions, motivations, etc. In this context, we'll be talking about one direction of this arrow, about how cognition may influence perception. By perception today, I'm going to be speaking broadly, encompassing both the phenomenological experience of seeing and also the lower part of the iceberg of unconscious visual processing. And by cognition, I mean to cast a very wide net as well, talking about desires, intentions, emotions, knowledge, language, etc. In the context of this workshop, perhaps ironically, since almost my entire career has been devoted to exploring objects, I won't have anything to say about objects. But I'll be talking about action a bit and concepts quite a lot. And in particular, the idea will be how concepts and actions do or do not interact in some particular ways with what we see. So just to try to motivate this question a little bit, science, we are told, is in part an exercise in trying to explanatorily carve nature at its joints. And the single best candidate, I think, for a joint in the mind is the joint between perception and cognition. At least in practice, that joint structures our courses, it structures our textbooks, it structures our job searches. Many of us think of, both intuitively and in terms of the sociology of our field, that perception somehow deserves to have a different label than the rest of cognition. And so the question is really, in this sense, the question for the talk today is, does perception really exist as a functional, is there a functional joint between perception and cognition in the mind to some interesting and substantive degree? Now, given the, I would say, fundamentalness of this question, it is perhaps no surprise that people have been talking about this for quite some time. Perhaps most saliently in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, there was an entire movement in psychology that most of you will have heard of called the New Look, which was essentially embodied a view on this question. People like Jerry Bruner were seen as the ringleaders of this idea. And we were presented with many ostensive counterexamples to the idea that perception is encapsulated from these extra-perceptual things. Probably most famously were Bruner's studies of value, suggesting that coins, for example, were perceived as larger than the equivalent discs, that the degree to which that was true was dependent on the value of the coins, and even that poor children saw coins as relatively larger than well-to-do children. And in this work, and in the related work I'll be talking about today, this is not meant to be metaphorical. This is not meant to be an understanding of size. This is meant to be literally a claim about visual experience and what sorts of factors influence it. Now, the New Look we don't hear that much about today because it met a sort of untimely end. I think the New Look was consisted of many, many extremely inspiring ideas. Really, it was an incredibly ambitious project that attempted to reconceptualize the organization of how we think about the mind. The problem is that in the end, those inspiring ideas were accompanied by rather less inspiring experiments. Here is a quote from sort of the aftermath of all of this from Matthew Erdelyi, writing in 1974. After 2.5 decades and probably more than 1,000 research publications, a verdict seems to have gradually crystallized from the gargantuan proceedings. Methodological inadequacies of the dominant New Look research appear to have undermined the voluminous research enterprise. In succeeding years, the word artifact became the descriptive term par excellence associated with the New Look. Following this, I think the orthodoxy had shifted, and we were treated to many interesting theoretical ideas about how perception may be encapsulated from cognition or might be cognitively impenetrable. But recently, the pendulum has swung again in the last decade or so. And it is not uncommon these days to see not just that people attacking this notion, but people deciding that the war is over and that this idea of encapsulation has lost. So taking the middle quote here, it is just a generally accepted concept that people tend to see what they want to see. A growing body of work in visual perception refutes the traditional framework. Without getting too bogged down in quotes here, I think this summarizes the view of many in the field today that people's current goals, needs, feelings, action possibilities, stereotypes, and cultural knowledge all systematically affect their supposedly basic perception. Now, this view was not and has not been driven by theoretical arguments. It rests on the back of a stunning and stunningly large amount of empirical research, all within the last, say, 12 years. So just to give you a flavor for what kind of research we're talking about, we are told that holding a wide pole makes doorways look narrower, that thinking immoral thoughts makes surfaces look dimmer, that categorizing faces as African American makes them literally look darker, that words related to morality are easier or faster to see, that wanting something, for example, chocolate, makes it literally look closer to you, that thinking about the elderly makes distances look longer, that being good at golf makes golf holes look larger, that being hungry makes food-related words easier to see. All of these studies were published relatively recently, within the last decade and a half, and all of them are attempting to make the strong version of this claim, that these sorts of factors are literally changing not just how we think about our visual experience, not just how we categorize our visual experience, but it literally changes the visual phenomenology itself. I also want to say that I didn't have to work very hard to compile a list like this. I very easily could have picked 9 completely different examples to show you. Oh, here they are. Social rejection makes smiles easier to see. Being afraid of heights makes heights look higher. Wearing a heavy backpack makes hills look steeper. Calling turquoise blue makes it literally look bluer. Political partisanship changes the perceived skin tone brightness. Being awesome at parkour makes walls seem shorter. Reading about orientation improves, horizontal vertical discrimination. Sad music makes obstacles look bigger. Scary music changes bistable figures, for example, from ropes to snakes. Being thirsty makes surfaces seem more transparent. Being on a diet makes muffins look larger. Faces of gossipy people are seen more quickly, and inevitably thinking about sex makes breasts look bigger, at least in male observers. For a recent forthcoming behavioral and brain sciences paper on this, we actually compiled a list. There have been over 200 empirical papers alleging things of this sort just in the last dozen years. Our thesis is that none of that stuff is true. In particular, that nothing in this gargantuan recent literature provides any compelling evidence against the so-called cognitive impenetrability of visual perception. And critically, that the reasons for this are few and interesting. It's not just that there are 200 different papers, each of them compromised by 200 different infelicities. It's that there are 200 papers that are all compromised by exactly and only 6 problems. And I hope to convince you that some of these problems are actually quite theoretically interesting and worthy of attention. So what would it take? What would it take to show that some form of cognition was changing visual processing or was influencing what we see? There are some reasons that I think are very, very important here, but that are not worthy of much discussion because they're kind of boring. They're important without being interesting. So for example, you'd have to replicate them. There have been some issues with some of these sorts of claims. I'm not going to talk about any of that research. You'd have to eliminate task demands. Some other people have focused on this. This is one of my favorite papers in this domain in recent years. This is a paper by Frank Durgan from Swarthmore. And he was addressing this particular idea due to Denny Profit's group that wearing a heavy backpack makes hills look steeper. And if you read that paper or any of the many dozens of similar papers that have come out of that lab, there is not a word about task demands. But of course, if you put yourself in the position of the subject, here, stand over here, put on this heavy backpack, now how steep does this hill look? The empirical hypothesis couldn't be more plain. What Frank did is a couple of things. First of all, he showed that you only get the effect in those subjects who guessed what your hypothesis was. And then second, he replicated the experiment, but he provided an alternate explanation for why you were wearing a heavy backpack. There were all sorts of wires coming out of the backpack, attaching fake electrodes to various parts of your body. It was complicated, electrophysiological recording equipment, and you were sorry you had to wear it, but there's no other way to make it portable. And when you do this sort of manipulation, the effects go completely away, suggesting that this was due to task demands. Super important, super devastating for that claim, but I think not especially interesting. Similarly, you'd want to rule out response biases. Another thing you'd want to do is distinguish perception, that is the input to the visual process, the visual processing itself, from attention, the input to the visual processing. Some of you may have noticed the tiny word interesting in the title of the talk. Of course, top-down effects can change how you see. I will do it right now. Top-down effects, for example, can change face processing, to talk about some of our recent talks. So I will look at Marlene, and I will now change through sheer force of will my representation of her face. Here we go. And now the reason that you laugh is that seems somehow like cheating. You say, oh, you didn't affect the nature of how vision worked, you just shut off the input to vision. Well, in many cases, that's what you're doing when you manipulate attention, is you're not changing how the visual circuits work, you're merely changing the input to them. I'm also not going to talk about that factor, in part because that factor, many other people have spoken about that in recent years. Zenon Polishin, for example, in his work, in his book that I showed earlier, talked a lot about this sort of factor. I would like to talk instead about 3 other factors that I think are more worthy of discussion and just as important. And they'll sound confusing at first, and hopefully they will sound less confusing in a little bit. So I think what you would need to really show this in a compelling way is a less confirmatory research strategy. You would need cool demos, and you would need to carefully distinguish perception from memory. Now, in these conversations about how perception and cognition relate to each other, as I said, this sort of debate, such as it is, has been going on in some form or another for a very long time indeed, probably since the inception of experimental psychology, and certainly explicitly in these terms, at least since the 1920s. One of the reasons why I think we have not made much progress is that so much of the effort has been on theoretical arguments about why perception should be thought of as encapsulated, or why perception should be thought to be influenceable by these sorts of other factors. And the problem with these arguments is not that they're not good, it's that they're almost too good on either side. I think there are compelling sounding arguments on each side of that coin. The approach that I'm going to suggest is a little bit different. I'm going to try to keep the discussion extremely well empirically tethered. Our goal is not to show that these kinds of things could matter, that they could potentially explain some of these results. Our goal is to show that they actually do matter. So I'm going to try not to talk about anything for which I don't have at least one empirical case study showing both how it actually does impinge upon this debate empirically, and also to show how in practice you can study these things. So this is not sort of a vague suggestion. And I want to say I think this is really important. Here's a little quote back from the New Look from Jerry Bruner. And so he talks about how critics in the past have found it convenient to dismiss his top-down effects on perception by invoking various dea ex machina, attention, apperception, some German stuff, preparatory set, etc. Like the vengeful and unannounced stepbrother from Australia in the poorer murder mysteries, they turn up at the crucial juncture to do the dirty work. And I have to say I'm very sympathetic to this. It's just too cheap and it's just too easy to say like, oh, well, you know, maybe it could be memory or attention or something like that. And so I think we shouldn't allow for that sort of thing. We should need to actually show empirically how this can make a difference. So I'm going to try to convince you that these are not cheap in principle possibilities, but they are actually concrete. And they're not vague suggestions, but they are concrete empirical questions. What would it take? So what we're going to do here, the structure is I'm going to have to take some case studies and go through how they work. And so I'm going to take 4 of the case studies from that list, chosen in many cases to be among the best, most cited, most prominent examples of this research. It also requires, though, that we do something that I try never, ever to do in my lab, which is to be critical of other people. Whenever in our lab we're attempted to write an experiment, to run an experiment showing that someone else was wrong, I think of this XKCD cartoon. The scientific literature is just so huge, and you don't have to work very hard to find some crappy study that you could criticize. Life is too short for that. We try just to make positive empirical contributions, but given the nature of this project, we're going to have to be reinterpreting some previous studies. So in particular, in terms of these questions here in green, the answer is going to be no, 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 no. Contravening previous suggestions. I feel very uncomfortable being critical like this, and so if you will permit me just a little bit of defensiveness here about why we're doing this. The strategies that I'm going to suggest are all new. I don't think that they've appeared in the literature before. They are, I hope, relatively widely applicable, and I will argue that in practice as we go through them. These are not just problems with random individual studies. I think each one of these literally applies to dozens of existing experiments. They don't rely on like a null effect or failing to replicate anything. In every single case, we're going to positively replicate each one of these findings. And I'm willing to be critical because, as I said at the beginning of the talk, I think this stuff this issue is so fundamental, and I think it matters so much. and the orthodoxy has shifted. Okay, my defensiveness is over. Let's get to the research. I should mention that this research project is a collaboration with a graduate student in my lab. This is Chaz Firestone. He will be going on the job market soon. He is incredibly fantastic. And let's jump into it. So a less confirmatory research strategy. Does holding a wide pole make doorways look narrower? Does thinking bad thoughts make surfaces look dimmer? In general, one way to categorize the types of evidence you could have in support of any given theory is you could find an effect when your theory predicts its presence, or you could fail to find the effect when your theory demands its absence. Both of these are straightforward, fair ways to test a scientific hypothesis. And it will probably not surprise you that in this literature, approximately 99.9% of the research has involved number one. So we're going to try to investigate number two a little bit. This research program begins with an infamous episode in art history. This is the Spanish Renaissance painter El Greco. And this is a self-portrait that he painted of himself. And evidently, El Greco is very widely respected as being a master artist for reasons that I don't quite understand. But one thing that many art historians have gone just into crazy depth into is a particular distinguishing fact of El Greco's paintings, which is that all of his figures are kind of weirdly elongated. You can see this in his self-portrait here. This is not a function of the screen resolution or something. Here are two others of his paintings. Here is Mary Magdalene in Penitence with this giraffe-like neck. Here is St. John the Baptist, who's 11 feet tall. And so, art historians go gaga for this sort of thing. So they want to know, why is this, why did he paint this way? And one hypothesis that gained some interesting traction, enough traction that it was talked about, whole books were published on this, is the idea that he may have suffered from severe astigmatism. So his cornea may have been slightly ellipsoidal, and that would have vertically blurred the image on his retina. And so perhaps the reason that he was painting these elongated figures is he was simply painting what he saw. This is now infamous in some circles, not for the interest of that idea, but because this is one of these sort of logical things where, despite the fact that this idea gained so much traction, it makes no sense at all. Because if you think about it now, El Greco, if he saw the world as elongated, he would also see his canvas as elongated. And so if he painted what he would saw, yes, it would look elongated to him, but it would look elongated to no one else. And so this was kind of really embarrassing. My graduate student Chaz went and got all these old books and pamphlets and stuff that had been written. People took this seriously for a long time, and it is a logical fallacy. We're going to try to exploit this in the context of some experiments. And the goal is to make this apply extremely broadly. So I'll tell you on purpose about two extremely different sorts of studies. The first one is ability and aperture width. So this comes from a paper, Big People, Little World, The Body Influences Size Perception. I think the idea of this experiment is pretty straightforward. It's very consistent with the hills look steeper sort of backpack thing. The idea is you look at an aperture, and the aperture, this is a figure from their paper. I did not draw this. This is, I guess, a person. Here is the aperture. You look at that. You imagine yourself walking through it. And then you look to the side where the experimenter is holding a tape measure, and you just say a little narrower, a little wider, to say how wide you perceived that aperture to be. And in some conditions, you're just standing there. In another condition, you're holding a really wide pole. And I trust the idea behind this is pretty straightforward. Here it is captured by a random animation on the internet. Okay. So the idea is that this is perception helping you out. You're holding the wide pole. You're going to bonk yourself on the doorway, so we'll let you see it as a little narrower to maybe make your action make a little more sense. So we replicated this. 7 different pole widths, 35 trials. Imagine walking through the aperture without turning your shoulders. Turn to the side. There's Chaz holding a tape measure. And sure enough, you get this effect. It's not a large effect, but it's extremely robust. We then replicated the experiment again, but this time, instead of having Chaz use as his measurement tool the tape measure, he used as his measurement tool another aperture. And this is another aperture that at the beginning of the experiment they were imagining themselves walking through. So now you get the idea, right? You're holding this pole, you look at the aperture in front of you, and then you have the guy adjust the aperture to the side to match what you see in front of you. Does everyone get the El Greco idea of this? If holding the pole makes the aperture look narrower, the effect has to disappear here if it's really a perceptual effect. And the effect does not disappear there. It's just as robust as when you're holding the tape measure. So I think we know from this that this effect cannot be a perceptual effect. If it was a perceptual effect, it had to go away. Since it didn't go away, it must reflect something else. Now let me say, one strength of this approach, I think, is it allows us to test for whether the explanation is perceptual or not without having to be clever and diving in to figure out what is the real explanation. And so in most cases, I'm not going to do that. In this case, just to show you that it's not magical, I think I'll just quickly show you what is actually going on here. It's kind of like the backpack case. Here, hold this pole. How wide is that doorway? I mean, how can the subjects not get this? Well, one way they cannot get it is if we give them a compelling alternate explanation. And in this case, I think we came up with one. Did anyone see this movie, Man on Wire, this documentary? About this tightrope walker. So we replicated the experiment. We had people come in to the lab. But before they did this, we made a big show of like choosing which pole we were going to give them. And in fact, we had all these different poles, but in fact, we always gave them the same one. And we told them the pole is meant to improve your balance, just like walking on a tightrope. And everyone's like, oh, just like walking on a tightrope. I get it. When you do this, the effect of holding the pole goes completely away, suggesting that the effect is completely due to task demands. In this case, if the subjects didn't think that this is what the experiment was about, then they don't show us the effect. Obviously, if this is perception, it would replicate. Now again, I don't want to be criticizing individual studies. I want to be criticizing many individual studies. I want to be criticizing an entire research field. So here's another example of the very same experiment conducted in as maximally different a context as possible. So leave action behind. Now we're going to talk about morality and lightness. So here's this cool paper about recalling moral behavior changes the perception of brightness. The way this experiment works is you think of a good deed you've done in your life or a bad deed and an ethical lapse. You write about it for a little bit, and then you judge the lightness of the room you're in, say. And when you do this, sure enough, it turns out that when you recall a good deed, the world is judged to be lighter, and these results are interpreted in terms of perception. So we replicated this, recall and describe a good, bad deed from your past. This was done on MTurk. There's some complicated things. We give them a little waiting period, make them do some math. And then we ask them, how bright is the room that you're in right now on a scale from 1 to 7? You get a small but reliable effect. We then replicated the study, except instead of rating the brightness on a scale from 1 to 7, they rated it on a scale from dark patches to light patches. Does everyone see the El Greco idea again here? If the world looks lighter, the effect has to go away, for the same reason that it makes no sense that El Greco would have been painting what he saw, because here the method of reproduction would be affected in just the same way. The problem is that we got exactly the same effect. So again, this cannot be a perceptual effect. Now you might say, well, wait a minute, if you look back to the title of that paper, it's called Is It Light or Dark? Recalling Moral Behavior Changes Perception of Brightness of Rooms, but not Patches on Computer Monitors. But no, that's the point. That wasn't the title of the paper. Could it be that there's something specific about judging this but not this? Of course there could be, but there's no independent motivation for that. So this illustrates this idea of the El Greco fallacy, I hope, the utility of this kind of approach. I don't think anyone's ever talked about this kind of empirical approach in this literature before. I think it applies, I showed you 2 examples, we think it applies to at least a dozen more. It doesn't require cleverness, it doesn't revolve around any sorts of null effects, and it's kind of in just the same way of the El Greco fallacy itself, it's a little bit counterintuitive. It also, by the way, allows you to apply it post hoc. So you don't even have to do experiments. Here's a somewhat infamous paper from Rob Goldstone's lab about how categorization changes color appearance. He showed you a bunch of letters, and the letters were all reddish, and then he showed you a bunch of numbers, and the numbers were all bluish, and you went through this over and over, and you learned to categorize them this way. And then you were shown a patch that was in a particular shade, and you had to report what color you saw in a matching task. And the result is that, if it's a letter, it looks a little more reddish, and if it's a digit after this categorization training, it looks a little bluish. The problem is that if you read the paper, they did it by adjusting another capital letter E. But if it makes E's look pinkish, then it would make the other E that you're using to report it look pinkish, and you should get no result. So I think that experiment, for example, and this is an example of the counterintuitiveness of this. I think that experiment makes no sense, even logically, and I don't think anyone has noticed this in the intervening 20 years since it was published. Okay, moving on. Oh, I thought I'd just say one other thing I like about the El Greco fallacy is that if you look back at Brunner and Goodman, this is the first page of their paper, and in a completely tangential, in passing way, he mentions an El Greco canvas on that first page of his paper, so I thought that was kind of delicious. So, moving on to the second of these three parts, what would it take? Cool demos. Does categorizing faces as African American make them look darker? Some of you will have seen this before. Please indulge me. Stare at the black dot in the middle of the screen. Don't move your eyes. Keep staring at that black dot. In just a moment, I'm going to advance to the next slide. When I do, I want you to keep your eyes open for just the count of 1. And then I want you to close your eyes. Everyone got it? Keep your eyes on the center dot. Wait till I advance to the next slide. When I advance to the next slide, don't move your eyes. Keep them on that dot for 1 second, and then shut your eyes. Ready? Go. And shut your eyes. Okay? You can open them again. That image that I showed you, that second one, was completely in black and white. If you would like to convince yourself of this, try it again. This time, do the same thing. Do the same thing. But then, when I go to the next slide, leave your eyes there for a second or for however long you wish, and then move your eyes to any other part of the image. Ready? People used to think that our actual color experience was changing here. It turns out that this is completely, like the previous backpack studies I showed you, completely due to a response bias. This has nothing to do with actual perception. Now, as soon as I say that, you should be thinking to yourself, what? How can that possibly be true? You would say, I just experienced it. I know it's not a response bias. I didn't show you any data or anything. This is what we have in vision research. We have not just data, we have demos. You know that that crazy weird thing followed by that awkward silence had to have been wrong because you can experience the result for yourself. You know that you really saw color and that it wasn't a response bias. It is a curious, awkward, important fact that in this literature of 200 plus experiments, there is exactly one demo. 199 of these papers don't have any demos. When I first read Jesse Witt's paper about how tool use affects perceived distance, but only when you intend to use it, I ran and got a rake, and then I intended to grab the ball, and then I didn't intend to grab the ball, and then I intended to grab the ball, and guess what happened? Nothing. When I read Emily Balcetis' thing that more desired objects are seen as closer, I took a bunch of money. It was actually a very high-value poker chip. That's a different side of my life. I'm not going to talk about that. And I put it in an envelope, and I stared at that envelope, and I took another envelope, and it had nothing in it, and I stared at those two envelopes, and guess what? They looked exactly the same distance from me. When I read that thirst modulates a perception, and this is not a joke. I really, when this paper came out in Perception, I did not drink water for like 12 hours. I became extremely thirsty. And guess what happened when I looked at the ambiguous transparent surface? Nothing happened. I think this is important. I think it's telling. I think it's consistent with the claim I'm making that these things are not perception. It's not like you have to have a demo in order to be studying visual processing, but it's kind of weird that you never get a demo. There's only one case I can think of where this isn't true, and this is also one of the most theoretically sophisticated papers to come out on this. It's a collaboration between a vision scientist, Dan Levin, and a social psychologist, Mahzarin Banaji. And it's about a connection between race and perceived lightness. And so for other purposes, Dan Levin had been using stimuli like this. These were actually used in a collaboration with Dan Levin and I in a study of inattentional blindness. And for various reasons, we wanted faces related to race that were that did not differ in their mean luminance. So here we have an African American face. Here we have a Caucasian face. But they've been constructed so that their mean luminance is actually identical. And when Mahzarin first saw these, what she said is that's kind of interesting because they don't look equally light. The African American face actually looks darker. And maybe you can experience this for yourself just looking at these stimuli here. And so they said, this is an effect of a higher level factor on perception. This is race, categorization by race influencing perception. And I think this is one of the most important such allegations. This paper has been cited umpteen times because it actually has this associated demo. And so this is worthy of some investigation. Now, those two faces differ in their perceived race. They also differ in various other sorts of low-level ways. That is not a criticism of Levin and Banaji. If they didn't differ in some low-level ways, they would be the same image and you wouldn't be able to do the study. So the question is, do those particular low-level ways, whatever they are, influence what's going on? There are a couple ways you could pursue this. You could try to figure out exactly what the low-level differences are and test all of them. If you just randomize the horizontal lines, for example, you can see that these images are actually quite different. No, Sharon, you can put that. You don't need that. You can put that back. It really interrupts my talk when you take it because the talk started with that there. Can you put it back? No? Okay. I'll hurry up. Okay. There's another strategy that you can use here, though, which means we don't have to work quite as hard. Rather than trying to control for the low-level factors, we'll just try to keep the stimuli the same but erase race. And we did this in the most brute way possible. We simply blurred the stimuli. We blurred them in a way that maintained they still have exactly the same mean luminance, exactly the same mean contrast. When the idea is that when you look at these, you don't see them as different races anymore because all the high spatial frequency information is gone. Now, we tried to study this exceedingly carefully. We ran this on MTurk. We showed these two stimuli to people. We asked them which one is blurrier, which one is larger, which one is darker, which one is more interesting. The questions of interest about light and dark were sort of buried in this series of questions. And we assessed their perception of race as carefully as we could. We said, describe the images, describe the blurry faces so that someone else could help pick them out. While they're visible, we said, are they the same age, gender, facial expression, race, etc. We asked them directly, did you guess that this was about race? And basically, this worked out quite well. Only 3% of people ever mentioned race when prompted in an open-ended way. All three of those people mentioned that they were the same race. They said they were of a white man in his 30s. Clearly, that's not a person seeing them of different races. Only 12% mentioned race when we mentioned faces. And 10 of those 12 all explicitly mentioned that they were the same race. 83% of people, when just asked to judge, said that they were the same. And that's not just a general bias. That was much more than age, gender, expression, etc. And so we just replicated the experiment. And maybe this can work as a demo for you, too. We just said which one of these mean luminance equated images is darker. And what we got is exactly the same results. It's that the one that started out as the African American face, because of the distribution of luminance profiles, was judged as darker. This is an MTurk experiment, so time and money are cheap, so we'll just do it again. And again, this is an extremely robust finding. At the invitation of some reviewers, we tried to do this even more carefully. They said, well, why don't make them volunteer? Why don't we actually make them select race for each face? So now for each face, they had to, from a drop-down menu, explicitly guess which one it was. And we had them do this for all of these other sorts of things, et cetera. Only 34% of them categorized them by race. I was even shocked it was this low, because remember, there is a luminance difference. We agree that, lightness difference. We agree that there is a lightness difference. The debriefing responses of the subjects were quite telling. For example, one subject said, "You really should allow a none option for the races. I didn't really perceive any, but I felt I was forced to choose." Even among the people who never mentioned race, you still get exactly the same effect, that the one on the left looks darker. Oh, and then we can replicate it, and yes, it still works. So the conclusion here is that this demo is very real, the demo of Levin and Banaji, but it's not a top-down effect on perception. It has nothing to do with race, because when we take race completely out of the equation, the effect does not change. I could talk more about the details of that experiment, but Sharon's looking at me, and she says I can't. Let me move on to the third example, distinguishing perception from memory. This is going to be about a recent, extremely high-profile, much op-edited about study about how moral words pop out in visual awareness. And for this experiment, what I would like to do is to distinguish perception, as in the perception of lightness, from what we would normally talk about as recognition, or as seeing, distinguishing seeing from seeing as. There are many things that can affect recognition that we would not normally attribute to being perception. Take, for example, like semantic priming in memory. Semantic priming can, for example, speed recognition of whether something is a word or not. But I don't think anyone in the history of cognitive psychology has ever been tempted to say, oh, semantic priming exists, therefore perception does not exist in a modular fashion. So keeping that in mind, let's turn to this paper, The Moral Pop-Out Effect, Enhanced Perceptual Awareness of Morally Relevant Stimuli, by Anna Gantman and Jay Van Bavel. This paper came out just last year. It got an incredible amount of press. It was in the New York Times. It was all over the place. And what they did, it was just a simple lexical decision task. You would see a word or a non-word, and the word could be related to morality or not, and then it was instantly masked just a few tens of milliseconds later, and then you just had to say, was it a word or not? And so this is a measure of how readily these words pop into your awareness. And what they discovered is at this critical threshold here, they said it was 40 milliseconds. If you know how display hardware works, you know you can't actually display something for 40 milliseconds. It doesn't refresh at a 10 millisecond intervals, but close enough, we'll say 40 milliseconds. Moral words are judged that those words were there more correctly than were non-moral words. So the idea is that morality is so important in our mental lives that even a word related to morality, certainly a high-level effect if ever there was one, literally jump more readily into your awareness. And this is true. We replicated this in our lab. It's a small but extremely robust effect. We replicated it basically with the exact same magnitude they did. So their conclusion is that because of this, moral concerns shape basic awareness. But they were really not making this distinction between perception and recognition. So here are the words that they used. For example, the moral words were all these sorts of words, and the non-moral words were just sort of other random words. And if you're thinking about this from the context of perception, it makes all the sense in the world, and this is what you'd want to test. But if you think of this in terms of recognition and memory, then we have a problem. Do you see what the problem is? It is not just the fact that these words are related to morality and these words are not. It is also the case that these words are all related to each other, and these words have nothing to do with each other. That, we think, is the sort of factor that is only going to come to mind when you're drawing this distinction between perception and memory. So they called their paper The Moral Pop-Out Effect, Enhanced Perceptual Awareness of Morally Relevant Stimuli. We called our paper Enhanced Visual Awareness for Morality and Pajamas, Perception versus Memory in Top-Down Effects. We simply replicated their experiment, but we replaced the moral words with fashion words. Blouse, dress, cotton, tuxedo, etc., and we replace the other ones with the non-fashion words. We're very careful in doing this. We equate word frequency and length and all this sort of stuff. So bikini has the same word frequency in English as does sludge. etc. Okay, we run the same exact task, and we get exactly the same effect. Okay, so again, it's not that we're not replicating their moral case, we're replicating it where their theory would certainly demand its absence. I don't think they're going to be quite so brave as to suggest that fashion is wired into the mind in this way. We also did it in other ways. We showed a transportation pop-out effect in the mind compared to non-transportation words. And so, again, this I think you'd start to think about moral awareness if you were thinking just about perception. But in fact, morality wasn't even the biggest effect. We found greater effects for fashion and transportation than we did for morality. And so I mentioned semantic priming earlier. I think this is not moral pop-out. This is semantic priming and nothing but semantic priming. By the way, you can dive into the details and show this in different ways. All the words and non-words were just completely randomized, so if you scan through this list, occasionally you'll find two, here done in fashion case, but this works in all of the cases. You find two words that appeared right in front of each other, two non-words, etc. When you look at these cases where the words appeared right in succession, that's where you find your priming effect. When you look at here, when the same word appears here, you get no priming whatsoever. The same exact thing occurs in the context of morality. This, I hope, serves as an interesting concrete example of why and how these experiments can be helpful. Just talking in general about like, oh, the distinction, maybe it could be memory, not perception, sounds really vague. It's really easy to say that. People say, oh, wait a minute, aren't there like interactions between perception and memory? Yes, our lab has done much of that work as well. But here we see how we can study this in practice. There's no concern about replicability or null effects, but we see a radical change in the interpretation of the results. Their results have nothing to do with perception. I think it's all to do with memory. And you can see here why this matters, because the results also have nothing to do with morality. It has only to do with semantic priming. There are so few slides left, Sharon. I'm going to sit up here. Do you want? Okay. I'm just going to stand like this for a little bit. Again, I only had time to show you one experiment here, but I think this perspective applies to literally dozens of other experiments. This recent paper on how hunger modulates conscious access in a similar paradigm, food-related words pop into your visual awareness. I don't think this has anything to do with perception. You're hungry, so what are you thinking about? Food. You've primed food in your head. The effect happens long before the stimulus was even presented. Here's a recent paper by Gary Lupian. And just to give you a sense of how well respected I am in my own laboratory, this is one of my own graduate students. Language can boost otherwise unseen objects into visual awareness. So this is a continuous flash suppression effect, if you know what that means. And you say the word elephant, and then you're faster to see an elephant pop into view. This is limbed very explicitly. Look at this, top-down effects, penetrability. This is limbed very specifically as that the language is influencing perception. But this has nothing to do. This is, again, just priming. It could be semantic priming. It could just be priming of visual features, for example. When you hear the word elephant, activation spreads, spreading activation. Everyone remembers this from the 1970s. Activation spreads to other visual features associated with the word elephant. You've lowered their threshold in memory, and then it's just like the cocktail party effect. You're more likely to see it because the sort of back-end memory has been activated. So those are three examples of kinds of research strategies that I think are new and that I think collectively help to compromise this literature. Now, this is part of a larger story, which I am not going to tell. I think there are 6 pitfalls. We have a forthcoming BBS paper on this. And I think these 6 pitfalls collectively compromise this entire literature such that we draw the conclusion that there are no top-down effects on perception, or at least there's no compelling evidence for top-down effects on perception. And this is not, unlike the previous iterations of this debate, a vague theoretical suggestion or a cheap in-principle possibility. These things we can show actually matter in concrete experiments, and we've provided a roadmap, I hope, for how you can actually run experiments that make a difference, that show this. And so I don't think there is any evidence for the other side of this arrow. Perception may be smart, but these extra perceptual cognitive factors do not, as far as we can see, no pun intended, influence visual perception. And that's it. Thank you very much. Was that 5 minutes?
Was it 5 minutes? Yeah.
5 minutes, yeah.
I think it was 6 minutes.
Okay.
Eileen?
So thank you so much. That was a real pleasure to hear. And I was totally with you until...
You could stop. Next question.
Until you spoke poorly of your own grad student.
Oh.
No. So what I'm trying to understand is where for you the line is drawn between perception. So to me, if something is activating, the way you put it, it's just semantic priming, the visual features are activated. If the visual features are activated, how is that not perception? What is perception then?
Certainly there is a sense in which it is perception. If it is, for example, bringing something to mind more quickly. And you wouldn't want to deny that. The question, I think, is there an interesting and substantive sense in which our experience could be encapsulated? Or does the existence of such effects show that everything affects everything else, or at least this one thing affects perception? So in this case, there is certainly a sense in which that affects your perception, but I think it is not fruitful to just say, does it affect perception, without asking how. And so in the context of that sort of study, one thing that I find helpful in thinking about this is to ask, when does the effect arise? I think that the effect arises in these cases before the visual stimulus is ever shown in the first place. Just the same way, right, you take the classic cocktail party effect, right? You're more likely to hear your own name. Is that because knowledge of your own name is influencing the nature of your auditory processing? Well, we think no, that sort of lower threshold on recognizing your own name exists in your mind long before your name is ever uttered. And so, so too in the example of language, the example of morality, that example of hunger that I said. When you have, and remember, these are not studies of seeing. These are studies of seeing as, right? This is word, non-word. So you always see the stimulus every single time. It's a question of, do you recognize what that stimulus was, in particular whether that was a word, whether that visual stimulus was a word or not. And recognition is always intrinsically, inescapably going to be a combination of very different types of processes. Front-end visual perception processes that are processing the incoming information. And if you're going to recognize something, that means making a connection with memory. And so you can have back-end processes that change the nature of those memory representations themselves. And to just say that that shows that, therefore, these factors can affect what we see, I think essentially sort of obviates that distinction. And I think that distinction is too important. So what I would say is, of course these factors can change what we see in the sense that recognition depends on memory. But that doesn't mean that there isn't a huge, broad, interesting, substantive swath of perception that could operate in an encapsulated, impenetrable way compared to these factors. You don't look satisfied, I must say.
Well, I'm just imagining, I guess you could do an experiment at maybe a level you'd be happy with. So looking at, cells being more prepared to fire. No.
We heard a lot about cells and brains, where there were no cells in this talk.
But would that be convincing to you if there was, if at a cellular level or anything faster? I mean, what would convince you?
I'm not going to answer any questions about cells or neurons because I have views on this that I would not like to sidetrack the conversation on. This question, what would it convince me? I really want to say this is not meant to be vague. I'll tell you what would have convinced me. Any one of the experiments that we've conducted that would test these alternate hypotheses coming out the other way. It could easily have turned out in any of the experiments that we ran that we were wrong. It really could have been that when you remove race from the equation, that the effect goes away too. That would have convinced me. It really could have been that when we ran this silly case of testing fashion words, that you didn't get the effect. That when we tested transportation words, you didn't get the effect. But when you test morality, you do. That would have convinced me. It really would have convinced me if, when holding the wide pole, you got the effect when judging it by a ruler, but not when you did it by judging it by two poles. That would have convinced me. So the sort of point about running these experiments is to say, it's not like a vague theoretical suggestion that can't be satisfied. Any of these things can be tested in a super straightforward way. So my answer to that question, what would convince me, is any one of these empirical questions coming out in the other direction. And I mean, just to be clear, it's not, this is not a case where our lab has a file drawer and we've tested hundreds of these things and 4 of them came out the way that I just told you about and all the others worked. Every single time we test this, all of these effects fall in these various ways. I have yet to see a case that would convince me. That's sort of the promise of the approach.
Rena?
So I want to follow up on Eiling's question and give you, to push you on the brain thing that you said and force you to reveal your dirty secret about brains or whatever.
Oh, good.
So I guess, and I want to push the question about the theoretical position. I was puzzled by your answer to her question that somehow because if the effects that you're studying pre-existed even before the experiment started, that therefore they're not perceptual effects, right? So somehow, Eiling was saying, what if there's no stage of processing that is unaffected by these top-down effects at all, right? Because to some degree, you did make a strong prediction. You said the phenomenology of perception, right? These demos should work if
or not that all of them should work, but maybe like 1 out of 50 should work, or something.
Right.
I mean, look, Marlene mentioned presenting at VSS, so we're vision scientists. We're all going to Florida next week to present at Vision Sciences, and you don't have to look very hard at VSS to find a new demo. They're all over the place because it's about seeing, and seeing involves demos, and it's just so striking that. Now I think we can say there are none. In 200 papers about perception, none of them actually change your perception.
Right. So I guess I'm going to give an example of the study that I remember. So let's say that you give somebody words that say left or right, and you try to prime their perception of moving dots, right? And you run this experiment, and what you show is in visual motion area, the V5 in the middle temporal complex, you get priming effects from these words telling you what direction you go, and you change the judgment of which way the dots are moving.
Yes.
Right? So that's, right, we know that part of the visual system is involved in the conscious perception of motion. Maybe we could quibble about the timing of those effects, right? You could say, no, those effects are happening too late, But let's suppose that you could show that these effects are happening at the earliest stage of visual processing of motion. They're happening in the part of the circuit that's involved in conscious vision. And as far as I can tell, the subject is seeing the thing different. Would that meet your criteria for top-down effects on vision, or would it still not meet your criteria? I'm just trying to clarify the position.
No, it would not meet my effects, these criteria. So the effect you're talking about is a very interesting study. It was conducted by Jonathan Winower and Lira Boroditsky. And did everyone get that idea, right? You hear the word left, and then you're more likely to see an ambiguously drifting dot pattern as moving to the left. It's a very, very small effect, I'll say first, that comes out in the statistical wash. You can't go try this on yourself and notice it. You might be, 2% more likely to see it in one direction or another. I think what's going on in that particular example is something that I didn't talk about, and it has to do with attention and imagery. If you test that effect, and before you do that, you give your subjects the VVIQ, the vividness of mental image, VVIQ, vividness of visual imagery quotient questionnaire. If you give them that thing, you can tell how involved I am in the details of this research. What you'll find is that those sorts of effects only work in high visual. So stepping back for a second, visual imagery, the vividness of mental imagery is very, very different across people. And this is something that personally we're only aware of our own vividness of our mental imagery. There are some people who just have incredibly reflexive, vivid mental imagery. There are other people who have almost no mental imagery. These sorts of effects, I think, are basically what's going on is you hear the word left and you are moving your attention to the left. You are, and I think there's some evidence for that. If you just say the word left, you will get a Posner queuing advantage for an item appearing on the left side of the screen. So your attention is moving left. You're imagining something moving left. And then it's no surprise that you're more likely to see an ambiguous pattern as drifting left, since you get those effects anyway.
I guess to me, I don't see the empirical distinction between saying imagery affects perception, right, which is an example of top-down effects on perception, and saying, well, I don't count that as perception, right? What about that is not perception?
I think that is, the issue with that particular study is not that it's not perception, it's that it's not a top-down effect on perception by something that's really extra perceptual. You're essentially changing the input to perception here. You're changing imagery and attention, and so I don't think it's of a piece with these sorts of higher level sorts of effects. This is just how perception works. How could it make an empirical difference? Well, I'm pretty sure if you had asked them in the beginning, the view that they had that there is a direct link between language, for example, hearing or reading the word, and motion perception, you would not have expected this to divide by, for example, high versus low mental imagery. So there's a straightforward empirical sort of thing. Could they accommodate that in some post hoc story? Absolutely they could. But here's where these two views make, again, different concrete empirical predictions.
Right here.
There are a lot of geometrical visual illusions, like the Ponzo illusion and the Müller-Lyer illusion, that often, I guess the most common explanation for them, uses the idea of top-down processing. And I was wondering, what's your opinion on those kinds of accounts of those kinds of illusions?
It depends on the particular illusion. I would say that with regard to something like the Müller-Lyer illusion, that's not actually the most. There are explanations to take that example that advert to the high-level factors. So probably you learned in intro psychology, infamously, for example, right, people in carpentered worlds are supposed to see this more generally, and this is due to the geometric structure of corners. Let's see. I'm not going to be able to pull this file up right here. I'll say that I think in the end this is one of these things that's just due to the statistical structure of the input, or rather the statistical structure of even your ancestors' input, that patterns that are associated with this are associated with longer versus shorter lines. So this is work that came out of Dale Purvis's lab. He took a representative sample of natural scenes, used a laser rangefinder to determine how actually far in the world these 2 points were, and then fit them to templates for things like this and like this, as in the standard Müller-Lyer illusion, and found that there was a difference. I think also, and this is work that my graduate student Chaz Firestone is doing now, I think it's quite possible that there are attentional differences that explain that sort of thing. So everyone knows about the Müller-Lyer illusion, right? I don't need to, right? So in the Müller-Lyer illusion, the line is, this is, I think, substantive. The line is the same length, but it doesn't look to be the same length. But the stimulus itself, the object, is not of the same length. Right? In the case where you see the line is longer, the object actually is longer. So, we're going to talk about objects after all. Good. The object actually is longer because the wings are sort of sticking out. In the case where you see the Müller-Lyer illusion is shorter, the object is shorter because the wings are sort of sticking in. And you can try to do things in an awkward sort of in the lab vision way where you try to judge the length of a line or something, but not the length of the object. But that's not the character of what we see. What we see and the nature of our visual conscious representations are we see objects out in the world. So I think it's a weird artifactual sort of thing to try to judge the length of the line. And attention, as we know, is automatically allocated not to lines but to objects. And so when you're trying to judge the length of the line in the Müller-Lyer illusion, you have a broader envelope of attention because the attention is selecting that object. Whereas when you're attending to it when the lines are going in, we think your attention is a little bit. And you can study this. It's kind of hard, but you can put up little dim attentional probes at different regions and try to look at where attention is. But so, for example, I think that's a case where you're just attending to those two stimuli very differently. And although the line is not the same size, the object actually is of a different size, and that's what's sort of driving the effect.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
I feel like I'm playing whack-a-mole. What about this study? What about this study? Does everyone hear that unamplified question? How could I falsify that question, that it's attention? Very, very readily one can falsify that question. Here are two ways just off the top of my head, although I admit this is not the first time that I'm thinking about this. We are running some experiments on this very kind of thing. The first thing you can do is you can put people under tremendous attentional load while they do the task, and you can ask whether the effect goes away. This view predicts that if you control where attention is, or control the amount of available attention, that the effect has to go away. The second thing you have to do to amplify on that very last thing that I said, you can measure where attention is. If I say it's just attention, and that attention is selecting a essentially longer region in one case than the other, that is a straightforward empirical claim. So what we can do is we can put up, while you're viewing these things, dim attentional probes. We can focus on those dim attentional probes that occasionally occur just outside the line itself, but not overlapping with the other visual stimuli. And we can test using probe detection here, following Posner, for example, as a measure of where attention is. We are forced to make the prediction that we have different attentional profiles in the two different stimulus configurations. If we find no such effect in a careful, highly powered case, that would also falsify the hypothesis. So again, I think in this case, I think it's pretty straightforward to test these things empirically.
Back here. And then you're next.
So first of all, I can see that you're quite versed in the literature on the top-down effects in perception. You're aware of the study by Glasgow guys where they show that if you tell people to discriminate whether they see faces and visual noise, and they will then sort these two different types of stimuli where they saw it and where they didn't. There's going to be an N170 elicited by the visual noise where participants said that they saw a face in there. Is that not top-down?
I think that is a straightforward example of visual imagery and attention in that case. There are many examples of that sort of thing where you can see illusory figures. My favorite example of this, so you get the N170 there, that shows that you're really imagining what you're being asked to imagine. My favorite example of this for anyone who follows the logic of reverse correlation studies is Philippe Schins did a study like this, where he showed you complete white noise, carefully constructed white noise at various spatial frequencies, but white noise nonetheless, and told you that, lying to you, that some of them contained the letter O, very, very dimly in the background. And you were just asked to say which ones contained the letter O. And if you then take all of those noise patterns that people said, yeah, I vaguely see a letter O, and you average those noise patterns together, what you see is the letter O. And so this is a case where there are sort of subtle things in the image that you can focus on that'll get you to see things one way versus another way. That certainly is a very real phenomenon, but that strikes me as just, again, changing the input to perception via attention and imagery.
Okay, so regarding the debate,
sorry, let me give just another example, another version of that. Here's another thing you can do. Shut your eyes and imagine a face. If you do electrophysiological measures of face processing, you will see face processing signatures. Why? Because you're seeing a face. Not because of the input coming in through your eyes, but because you're imagining a face. I would certainly not want to deny that that imagery doesn't exist, but I don't, for the context of this debate, I don't see what's interesting about having it happen with a white noise pattern compared to having it happen when your eyes are closed.
I mean, yeah, more generally just trying to, I think, spin the debate that was long answered. or addresses that in some cases it's the stimulus that's driving perception, in some cases it's the expectations and your goals driving perception. One is in the case where you have optimal conditions for vision, and in the other case where, when the input is really noisy.
Or non-existent.
So it's, age-old debate. I mean, I find it extremely difficult to agree with that your goals and your expectations do not modulate what you see. I mean, this is how we manage to do what we intend to do.
So here I think is the question. I'd say two things in relation to that. The first thing I'll say is apparently all the people doing these experiments don't find that sort of evidence dispositive. I take it that it is common ground among everyone that you can imagine a face. And if that settles the question about whether top-down effects exist, then maybe a lot of people were wasting their time running these 200 different studies. The question, I think, is there an interesting and substantive sense in which perception is immune from your expectation? Expectations and predictions are a complicated term to use here, as is a word like inference, because sometimes we talk about perception itself engaging in a la Helmholtz unconscious inferences and predictions, etc. But the kind of predictions you're talking about, the kind of expectations you're talking about, is there an interesting and substantive sense in which perception is unaffected by those things? And I would say the fact that you can imagine a face does not suggest that the answer to that question is no. That because you can imagine a face, that there is no interesting substantive sense in which perception may be encapsulated from such things.
Back here. Just right next to him. You're fine? Okay, Jerry. right here in white. Yeah.
So, Eiling didn't quite get to the end of your talk and, believe it all the way through. I believed it all the way through. You just lost me in your answer to some of the questions.
Okay.
And I think part of it is that I'm not sure we really still understand what you mean by the distinction between perception and seeing. So if someone is hallucinating, imagery or perception, if I have macular degeneration and I'm hallucinating spectacles on your face, it's not in the signal. It seems to me that what you're wanting is to see some modulation of the signal. You want to see some interaction with the external signal that is coming in. If that's what you mean, then maybe we can now start talking about what would it take to dismiss other kinds of things. So, for example, work that Sharon and I have done, you have people reading in the scanner and you see that there are effects right down towards close to V1 or wherever it is, right, when they're reading, okay? Now, is that imagery? Hard to say because the participants aren't all saying, we're imagining this. If I now give them a visual signal that's going to go into V1, presumably that prior activation in V1 is modulating that input, will modulate it. I can't see neurophysiologically how it could not. And then that, to me, looks like a top-down influence on the incoming signal. Whether I report behaviorally that I see that signal differently is another matter. So I'm just trying to get at what you're really meaning here by perception in a sort of behavioral sense.
I want to answer this very broadly because I think the claim that is supported by the existing evidence is quite broad itself. Remember I showed you that example of the color after image? To a first approximation, that's perception. And so that's the experience, and that's the kind of experience that we all are exceptionally familiar with thousands of times a day. I want to know if that sort of thing can be influenced by all these other sorts of factors. Beyond the actual experience itself, I want to know about the processes that generate that experience. Can those processes be affected by all of these other things? It has not gone unnoticed that I did not talk about brains or back projections to visual cortex or anything like this. That I take it is also common ground in this debate. It is completely incontrovertible that such back projections exist, that there are re-entrant pathways from all higher levels back down as early as possible. That research program, in fact, is basically over because, well, you know, take attention. Once Sabine Kastner showed that not just V1 is influenced by attention, but LGN is modulated by attention. The only way to go after that is to say, like, the air 2 inches in front of your eyes is modulated by attention, which I wouldn't be surprised by either. I take it that that's common ground for all of this. I haven't seen anyone seriously argue that the mere existence of those types of pathways, without any specification of what those pathways are doing, settles the question that these visual processes are fully penetrable by these sorts of factors. Again, if that were true, it would have been kind of weird for all these people to run these 200 studies to try to show this if just the root existence of such pathways made a difference. I think in general, such circuitry exists, and we have approximately no idea what it's doing. And I think it's going to be too quick to simply say that because it exists, that's going to settle the issue. But I want to go back to the first part of your question and say my hope, what I really want to avoid here is the idea that, oh, this kind of perception that you're talking about is this sort of vague, elusive target. I want to suggest that it's the least vague, least elusive target in general. I mean, take your perception of the color of Alfonso's shirt or the orientation of this table or any of these visual illusions like color after images. That's perception. Whatever else perception might be at the sort of boundary. Right? You walk into your house late at night, you think it's your cat sitting on the couch, and then you realize, oh wait, that's my crumpled up coat, right? Did your perception change in a way? I don't know. But take these like uncontroversial, obvious cases of perception. Are those experiences able to be modulated by these top-down factors? Are the processing, the types of processes that give rise to those experiences able to be modulated by this? This should be the most straightforward, easy to grasp cases away from the fuzzy boundary in the world. And I think when you look at the evidence, there is not yet compelling evidence that those sorts of things are influenced.
And with that, I'm afraid we're out of time. So I want to thank you and all the speakers for a fantastic first day.